Hi, I'm Frieda Anderson. I showed you in a previous video how I spray basted this project, and now I'm going to walk you through basic machine quilting. This is a nice size project to work on your home domestic machine. It measures about 40 by 70 inches. If I was going to do any marking on this quilt, I would do it now before I started any of the other machine quilting on it. But I'm not. It's a pretty basic project and I'm going to do real basic quilting on it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to roll it up into a package so that it will very easily fit between the arm of my machine and the needle on my domestic sewing machine. And then I'm going to start by doing stitch in the ditch, anchoring the quilt. Stitch in the ditch is stitching right between where your two seams come together where you have pieced the blocks. So the first thing that I will do is I'll start in the center and I will stitch from right about here up to my first border, and then I'll come back to the center and I'll stitch down to the border again, and then I'll come back and I'll stitch out this way and finally out that way. In essence, I've made a big X in my quilt that will anchor it, and then I will come along and I will stitch along each of those straight seams. That will give me a nice anchor that will hold the quilt together very well for me. I'm going to quilt this in that first process with a 50 weight cotton thread top and bottom. I like to use cotton in my projects, to do that I'm going to use a quilting needle. The quilting needles are designed for machine quilting and they have a sharp shank. That means that the point of the needle is very sharp so that it will pierce through all three layers of my quilt project. When we are piecing our quilts, we will use a universal needle, which is designed to put things together very nicely, but they're not designed to do quilting. You want to use a sharp shank needle when you're doing your machine quilting. So once I have anchored my quilt layers together, then I will come back in and I'll change the color of my thread and I will quilt all of my trees and my trunks, and again I'll start in the center and I'll work my way out. Once I've done all the trees in the trunks, then I will come back in and do any quilting that I want to do in any of these background areas. Because there are signatures on this quilt, I'm probably not going to do anything very fancy, probably just a very light stippling in these areas. And in fact, I really wouldn't even have to quilt them very heavily if I didn't want to. That anchor quilting is going to hold the center of my quilt together very nicely. Once I have quilted the center of my quilt, then again I will come back in and do stitch in the ditch around each of these border areas. I like to do stitch in the ditch on my quilts. It just gives it a nice crisp finish and keeps my line straight, and I will come back in and do stitch in the ditch around all of the flying geese as well. And I might put a little decorative something inside these flying geese and probably something in there and there as well, but we'll see as we progress along. So why don't we get started with this project? Well, here we are at the sewing machine and I'm going to get ready to start the machine quilting. A couple of things that I want to do before I get started. You can notice that I have the quilt rolled up into tubes so that it very easily will fit between the arm of my machine and the needle of my machine. I also have the front end of it rolled so that I don't have any area of my quilt hanging off of my table. That will make sure that I don't have any drag. One of the things that I think can be a big deterrent when you're starting on a bigger project is to have drag. So I want to make sure that the whole project is supported. I have my machine sitting in a sewing cabinet, and then I have another cabinet that butts up to it. So I have a nice big area and my project is supported all the way and it can very easily slide and be moved. One of the things that I mentioned when I was basting the quilt is that I spray the back of the backing fabric with spray sizing so that it will be slickier, it will move more easily on my table here. And a tip that I got from one of my students is that she also uses Pledge, and I spray my table with Pledge so that it is also nice and slick and so that everything moves really easily. You want to be able to move the project easily. When you are quilting a project that's bigger like this on a home domestic machine, you're really only going to work on an area about the size of a dinner plate. And then you're going to have to readjust the quilt and readjust your hands so that you can work in the next area, because you are limited by the arm on the machine here. Some of the other things that I want to do before I get started is, for this process, which is a stitch in the ditch, and I'm using a straight stitch, I want to have a walking foot on my machine. A walking foot can feed the top and the back along evenly together so that I don't get any puckering when I'm working. So if you're going to do any straight stitching on your quilt projects, you really do want to invest in a walking foot. You can get a walking foot for any of the model sewing machines that are out there. Some other things I want to do before I actually start is I want to make sure that I have enough of the thread color that I'm working with. I have had the experience of where I'd have to run out to the store because I ran out of the thread color that I needed. I also want to make sure that I have wound myself a bunch of bobbins and I have those ready to go, so that as my bobbins run out, I don't have to stop and rewind bobbins. And I'll have all that sitting in a little basket over to the side so that it will all be readily available for me to grab and use. I put the same color bobbin thread as I have on the top. I'm using a 50 weight for this process. I like to use cotton thread, but any of the threads that you like to use are going to work fine for this process. So I'm going to get started with my machine quilting. One of the other things that I like to do to make it easier to handle the quilt is I'm going to use something on my fingers to keep them tacky. I've got here, this is Neutrogena hand cream. This is a tip that I got from reading Diane Gadinsky's book. This will just keep the tips of your fingers tacky so that when you're holding on to your project, they're not sliding around. You can also use quilting gloves. Those work great too. Clover makes a great product that will also keep your fingertips from being slick, and any of those things that work for you. Part of the process of machine quilting is discovering really what works great for you. So I'm going to get started in doing the basting, stitch in the ditch on this quilt, and I'm going to end the video with that. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I have my walking foot on my machine, I have my thread threaded, I have a new needle in there. I made sure that I cleaned my machine before I started, and now I'm just making sure that my tension is good and that I'm good to go. Just got a quilt sandwich here made up with the same fabric and batting that I'm using in my project, and I'm making sure that my tension looks good, and it does. I have my stitch length set at 2.5, which is a little bit bigger, but because I'm going in between all of the layers here, I just think that that works nicer to have a little bit bigger of a stitch. And I'm going to start here right in the center of my project. Notice that I have this kind of up here in my lap, so to speak. One of the things that I always do when I'm quilting is I bring my bobbin thread up to the top. So I've just taken, I have to put my foot down to do that on this machine. I've taken a manual stitch and I've grabbed the top thread and the bobbin thread. The reason I do that is I don't like to have my bobbin thread flapping around on the back of my project. And I'm just going to put my needle right back in where it came out of. I've got my good glasses on so I can see, and I'm just running that straight stitch right up the seam where my two quilt blocks have come together. Stitch in the ditch right there in between the two. It actually will kind of disappear because of when you kind of pull it apart a little bit, the stitch just kind of sinks down into that ditch. And now I have to stop. Notice I didn't get very far. I have to stop. I'm going to pull this up a little bit. I'm going to open this up a little bit more. I'm going to reposition my hands a little bit so that I'm always in control of what I'm doing. And I'm not going really fast. I'm working at a nice, even, steady pace so that I can be in control. I'm going to stop right there again and just readjust a little bit. Make sure my seam is opened up. I'm kind of pulling it apart with my hand so that it stays nice and open. One of the things that I do before I put my sandwich together is that I make sure that all my seams are going in the right direction. You know, sometimes when you're piecing and you're putting blocks together, sometimes one end of the seam will get flipped one way and it'll get flipped on the other side. I want to go in and make sure that all of my seams are going in the right direction, because if I have that seam flipped in the middle, it's going to push my stitch over to one side when I'm doing this stitch in the ditch. I also always keep my needle in the down position when I'm quilting, so that when I stop, my needle is always engaged down, and that it isn't going to move on me, and I'm going to be in the same spot when I start up again. And here I've come to that first border, so I'm going to stop right there in the border, and I'm going to pull this up, and I'm going to cut my threads. I always like to bring my threads up to the top. I mentioned that I'm going to bring that bobbin thread up to the top when I start, and I'm also going to bring that bobbin thread up to the top when I'm finished. And one of the ways that I deal with my threads when I'm machine quilting is I'm going to bury them using a self-threading needle. So I've just tied a square knot that is flush right there on the surface of the quilt. I'm going to use a self-threading needle to grab both ends of my thread. I'm going to pull it through the end, and then I'm going to pull it into the inside of my quilt sandwich and give it a little tug, and then just clip it, and that's going to contain my threads. That's how I deal with all my threads when I'm doing my machine quilting. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to finish up all of the stitch in the ditch on this particular quilt, and I'll come back in another video and we'll talk about some free motion quilting. I hope that you've learned a few things here, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.